Chapter 1. The House at the End of the Street. In September 1872, with just £10 in my pocket and no prospects of finding work in the coming months, I was forced to move to the outskirts of London, to the East End. The torrential rain, the slush, and the biting wind did nothing to lift my spirits as I dragged my small but heavy belongings along Skinward Street in search of house number 32, where I had miraculously managed to rent a cheap room. I had promised the landlord, Mr. Brickman, that I would arrive earlier, but urgent matters had delayed me in the city centre, and I was late for the appointed hour. It was already dark, and the twilight blurred everything more than 20 yards away. The few passers-by, wrapping themselves in scarves and shawls and futilely shielding themselves from the relentless rain with fragile umbrellas, hurried on their way, paying me no mind. I trudged along the narrow street, lined on one side with grim grey houses with peeling walls, and on the other side with dense thickets of shrubbery behind a crooked, rusty fence. I was soaked to the bone and beginning to shiver from the cold. Such rains hadn't been seen for years. After walking another 30 yards, I stopped at the next intersection and realized that I was completely lost. "Excuse me, sir," I called out to an elderly man hurrying past me. The man flinched slightly and seemed about to walk on as if he hadn't heard me. But then he stopped and gave me a distracted look. "Could you please tell me," I continued, "how to get to house number 32? It seems I've completely lost my way." "House 32? He furrowed his brow, trying to remember something. "No, but if you tell me who owns the house, perhaps I can help." "Yes, sir. It's Mr. Brickman." "Ah, of course, of course." A shadow flickered in his grey eyes, but quickly disappeared. "You need to go back to the last intersection and turn left into the alley. Go straight, and you'll come to the house." "And how will I recognize it, sir?" I asked, somewhat bewildered. "Oh, believe me, you can't miss it. It's the only inhabited house in that area." He turned, and without waiting for thanks, quickly walked away. Retracing my steps, I indeed found a narrow alley leading into the shrubbery behind the rusty fence. The alley was thick with overgrowth, and it was no wonder I had missed it the first time. The twilight was quickly deepening, but in the distance, I could see a house with a dim light glowing on the porch. I sighed heavily and headed toward it. The stones of the cobblestone path were overgrown with grass and small bushes, forcing me to watch my step to avoid tripping. On either side of this old, abandoned street stood the ruins of former houses with sunken roofs and blackened gaps where windows had once been. These houses must have been standing for decades, and they had certainly been abandoned for just as long. Between and behind them, forming a dense grove, were ancient beeches with thick, mighty, but somehow twisted trunks and branches that resembled the gnarled fingers of some mythical monster. Chapter 2. Settling in. With the most miserable mood and soaked to the skin, I approached the porch, dimly lit by an oil lamp, and knocked on the door. To my surprise, it quickly opened, and the gaunt face of an old man emerged from the darkness of the hallway. "Mr. Turner?" The old man's raspy voice sounded like the creak of rusty hinges. I involuntarily shuddered at the sound, but tried not to show it. "Yes, sir, that's me. And you must be Mr. John Brickman, sir? Unless, of course, I've mistaken the house number." The old man hurriedly stepped aside to let me in. "No, sir. You haven't. But I'm Eliza Brickman, and John is my son." He placed the advertisement for the room. Come in, please, sir. I was expecting you earlier and so didn't light the lamp." "Just a moment." I entered the house, placed my wet belongings on the floor, and closed the door. The sound of the rain softened slightly. I wiped my face and forehead with my hand and looked around. The large living room was illuminated only by a candle on the mantel of an ancient fireplace. In the dim light, I could make out the outlines of a kitchen and a crude staircase leading to the second floor. The low, smoke-stained ceiling, uneven walls, some with cracks and crumbling plaster, and small, narrow windows. Meanwhile, the old man had lit a large kerosene lamp with a green shade. The room brightened, allowing me to see him more clearly. He was rather off-putting. Gray, tangled hair, shabby clothes, slightly trembling hands with long, crooked fingers and uneven yellow nails. His sharp facial features, especially his dull gray eyes, hinted at cunning and greed. "Come, sir, I'll show you your room, and tomorrow my son will come and tell you everything else." The old man took the candle from the mantel and headed towards one of the rooms on the first floor. "And do you not live here yourself, sir?" I asked in surprise, following him. "No, sir. I live with my son nearby in the next block, and here we only rent out rooms." "Are there any other tenants?" I asked cautiously. "No one else right now, sir. Too few people are willing to rent our hovel. So for now, the house is entirely at your disposal." The flickering candlelight cast uneven, strange shadows on the ceiling and walls. We reached a door, and the old man opened it and disappeared into the darkness. "One moment, sir." His voice came from the room as he struck a match, and the room was illuminated by the soft but dim light of the lamp. "Come in, sir." To my surprise, the room was rather clean despite everything being touched by time: the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. The furniture consisted only of a wooden bed, a small, roughly hewn table, and a similar chair. A small, round window, covered with a piece of burlap, looked out onto the backyard. But it was already so dark outside that I could see nothing. Besides, a heavy downpour had started, and the rain drummed against the glass. "The key to the front door is here on the table, sir." The old man looked at me expectantly, clearly eager to leave. "Yes, Mr. Brickman. Thank you. You may go." "Thank you, sir. Have a good night. John will stop by tomorrow afternoon." The old man turned and left the room. I heard his shuffling steps through the living room. Then the front door closed with a thud, the key turned, and everything fell silent. The house was plunged into quiet. The exhausting day had drained me, so I simply collapsed onto the bed and immediately fell asleep like a baby, lulled by the sound of the rain and the rumbling thunder. My situation no longer seemed so dire. Oh, how wrong I was. Chapter 3. Meister Brickman. Yesterday's difficult day had completely worn me out, so I woke up late. The rain showed no sign of stopping. Large drops drummed against the glass and the steep roof of the house. Now I had plenty of time to thoroughly examine my new dwelling. The meager light of the gray day seeped into my room through a small square window. I was surprised to find that the floorboards were almost new, still retaining the scent of fresh wood, and the walls were neatly painted. As far as I remembered, the living room had an old floor, and the walls were cracked and crumbling, and there was a persistent smell of damp and mold everywhere. I left the room to verify this, and indeed, the living room and the entire house gave the impression of an old, abandoned building, except for my room. Walking around the house, I found 3 more rooms, 2 upstairs and another one next to mine. I tried the door handles in vain. They were all locked. The owners probably didn't want tenants wandering aimlessly through the house. I found this quite reasonable and merely shrugged. I had accumulated a rather large archive of papers that needed to be sorted, so I immediately got to work. 2 hours passed in the blink of an eye. and I was startled when I heard the sound of the front door opening and someone moving quickly through the living room. It took me a moment to realize that it must be Mr. Brickman's son, John. I quickly got up from the table and left my room. In the living room, I immediately saw a ruddy, portly young man of about 35. He hung his cloak, from which streams of water were still dripping, on a hook by the door, and now stood in the middle of the room, wiping his hands and face with a handkerchief. Oh, Mr. Turner. His face broke into a broad smile, and he briskly approached me, extending his hand. "John Brickman, sir." I shook his outstretched hand and greeted him. "Sir, I was delayed by business yesterday, so I asked my father to meet you. And now I've stopped by for just a few minutes to see you and answer any questions you might have, sir." His face continued to shine with a smile, but his eyes... I had the feeling that his gray eyes were carefully and intently studying me. "There's a good grocery store not far from here, sir. You should definitely visit," Brickman continued to chatter. "I'll be stopping by from time to time for household matters. But don't worry," he added, noticing my raised eyebrows. "I won't inconvenience you in the slightest, sir." I nodded and attempted to mimic a smile. I didn't like this man at all, despite his ostentatious friendliness and talkativeness. "The fireplace and kitchen are entirely at your disposal, Mr. Turner," he said, making a sweeping gesture around the living room. "You'll find everything you need here." For understandable reasons, I refrained from asking him about the locked doors, not wanting to appear overly curious. Instead, I inquired why such extensive repairs had been made to my room. After all, it was not a cheap undertaking, and without a compelling reason, it would be a significant burden on the budget. "You are right, sir. It was not a cheap endeavor." Brickman hesitated slightly, glancing away for a moment. "I didn't want to tell you, but earlier this year, there was a minor mishap with the house's roof, and your room, along with the room above, was flooded. So we had to repair the ceiling and walls and lay down a new floor. Please don't worry. It won't happen again, I assure you, sir." He smiled broadly, giving him an uncanny resemblance to a large toad. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I'll take my leave." He bowed politely. "And do visit the grocery store, sir. I highly recommend it." After he left, I stood in the living room for a while, pondering his words. His explanations seemed reasonable enough to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vague unease. Perhaps, I thought, the cause was the persistent rain and the thick fog of dampness. Chapter 4. A Walk. I worked for another couple of hours before noticing that the rain had lessened, and it had become slightly brighter outside. My back had long since ached from the uncomfortable position, and my head felt too heavy to continue working. So, I decided to take a walk down the street and clear my mind. Dressing quickly, I stepped outside and breathed in the moist, fresh air with great pleasure. My head cleared immediately, and I laughed at my own excessive suspicion. In the daylight, the old houses were clearly visible, and I walked along the cobblestones towards the nearest one. The main street was quite far from here, and the sounds of the city were lost in the dense foliage of the massive beeches. All that could be heard was the occasional bird song and the rustling of rain on the fallen leaves. I walked slowly, enjoying the stretch in my legs and back, but as I approached the first house, I froze in front of it, staring at the dilapidated building in bewilderment. And indeed, there was reason to be surprised. Part of the roof and the second floor had cracked and partially collapsed due to a hole in the wall on the first floor, right where the house's corner window had been. The hole had jagged edges of crumbling brick and gray plaster, covered with a crust of moss and decayed lichen. It was easy enough to pass through the hole into the house, which I did with great caution. trying not to snag my clothes or hands on the stones and bushes inside. All the wooden furniture and floorboards had long since rotted away, turning into unsightly, shapeless piles of yellowed debris, overrun with dark green, thick ivy. Scattered around the room were small items, everything in disarray, as if the inhabitants had fled this once cozy home in great haste or even panic. In the room's depths, I could see a hearth overgrown with grass, built from rough gray stones. But even from a distance, a small moss-covered ledge in the wall caught my eye. I approached it and bent down to examine it more closely. Yes, I wasn't mistaken. Faint numbers were visible on it. After some effort, I managed to make out the inscription 1643. As I suspected, these buildings were at least 200 years old, but 50 years ago, people were still living in them. I exited the house and walked further to the next building, located 20 yards from the first. A similar hole was present in this house, but where the front door should have been. The rusty railings on the porch were improbably bent and twisted. I climbed the remnants of the porch and cautiously peered into the doorway. The damp, heavy smell of wet leaves wafted from the dim interior of the large hallway. Rain dripped through the remnants of the roof, echoing through the house. Mesmerized, I stood outside, hesitant to enter this shadowy space. Whatever had caused these destructions was indeed a powerful force, and I was at a loss to guess its nature. My thin cloak had begun to soak through, and I felt a slight chill. So, not wasting time inspecting other buildings, I turned and quickly made my way back. The brief lull was replaced in an instant by wind and heavy rain. The sky darkened again with heavy gray clouds. It seemed they were hanging directly over the treetops. Lightning flashed, thunder rolled deafeningly nearby, and the rain poured down in torrents. I burst into the house and shut the door behind me with relief. Despite being drenched to the bone, my exhaustion had vanished, and I felt energized again. So I worked late into the evening, and when sleep finally overcame me, I extinguished the lamp and eagerly climbed into bed. Chapter 5. The Uncanny House. But that night, my sleep was restless. Perhaps it was due to the overly humid air and oppressive stuffiness, or perhaps it was the brief but vivid dreams I had as I drifted in and out of deep slumber. Several times I awoke in a sweat, unable to sleep for long periods, trapped in a foggy daze. I dreamed of endlessly falling into a black, bottomless void, my descent accelerating with each passing moment. And the faster I fell, the tighter my heart clenched with fear. I awoke again, sitting up in bed and throwing off the blanket. The rain relentlessly drummed against the window. There was a very faint but persistent smell in the room. I sniffed. Yes, the smell was real, not imagined. Sharp and repulsive, but very weak. I anxiously inhaled the air again, and then I remembered that I had walked through the mud today, and perhaps the smell came from my shoes, which I hadn't cleaned as thoroughly as I should have. Somewhat reassured, I lay back down under the blanket and quickly fell asleep, this time without dreams. When I woke in the morning, I went into the living room and discovered that Mr. Brickman had already been there quite early, as evidenced by the candle stub on the table. Whatever necessity prompted these visits, they didn't bother me, and that was enough for me not to pay them any mind. Towards noon, I decided to take Mr. Brickman's advice and visit the grocery store. I needed to replenish my supplies, but I must admit, that wasn't the real reason. I was eager to learn more about this house and the other nearby homes. There were many similar districts on the outskirts of London, but this one was strikingly different from all the others. There are quiet, abandoned places, but this place was too quiet and too deserted. I found the store quickly enough. It was located on the main street between a dirty laundromat and a pawnbroker's house. The old sign, with its letters faded by time, read, "Smith's Groceries." Leaping over the murky stream that ran along the edge of the cobblestones and narrowly avoiding a fall on the dirty stones, I found myself in front of an old glass door with a brass handle worn to a shine. Opening the creaky door, I heard the jingle of a bell above the entrance and stepped inside. Directly opposite the door was a long, wide counter, behind which stood a stout man with a short, thick beard. He eyed me with interest. "Good day, sir. What would you like to purchase?" "I have a large selection," the grocer said in a deep bass voice, gesturing toward the counter and shelves. I greeted him and handed over my list of necessary items. "Forgive my curiosity, sir, but you seem new around here?" The grocer put on his glasses and began gathering the items on the counter, checking them against the list. "I know everyone in this area, but I've never seen you before." "Yes, you're right. I only rented a room here the day before yesterday." "My name is Jerome Smith, sir," he said with a friendly smile. "My father and grandfather owned this shop before me, so I've known the local area and all its residents since childhood." He pulled a paper bag from under the counter and noisily unfolded it. "Forgive my curiosity once again, sir, but may I ask where you're staying?" "It's the Brickman family, John and his father," I replied, immediately noticing the same shadow flicker in his eyes that I had seen in the passerby on the street a few days ago. "Yes, of course. I know them, sir, and their house too." The grocer's cheerful mood vanished. He huffed and began packing my purchases into the paper bag. "It's a strange house," I cautiously continued the conversation. The grocer merely glanced at me sideways and redoubled his efforts to pack the groceries. In the ensuing silence, the only sounds were the rain drumming against the shop's windows and the grocer's labored breathing. "And the street, too. No one lives there. What happened?" My curiosity was becoming too apparent, but to my surprise, Smith responded. "Forgive me, sir, for being so blunt, but you are indeed new to these parts." The grocer paused for a moment, wiping his suddenly sweaty brow with his hand. "I'm not one to spread gossip and never have been, but I'll tell you as a good Samaritan, since you're so keen on knowing. People say all sorts of things about that street and not all of it good. No one has lived there for 50 years except for those Brickmans. And even then, they only rent out rooms, living further up the street themselves." I looked at him expectantly, saying nothing. "As you rightly said, it's a strange place, sir. No better way to describe it. Even the local vagabonds prefer to avoid it." Smith chuckled grimly into his beard and continued. "No one knows what happened back then, but people scattered like cockroaches. Within a month everyone moved out and left their homes behind." The grocer shook his head as he continued packing the bag. "And where they moved to, no one knows. But no one stayed behind, except for the old man and the father of young Brickman. That'll be 50 cents, sir." Smith fell silent abruptly, noticing my pale face. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "I hope I didn't scare you too much with my foolish tales." "Yes, I'm fine, Jerome. It's just—" "Your story puzzled me a bit," I replied, paying and taking the bag of groceries. "Thank you. Come again, sir, and sorry for upsetting you." I had already reached for the door handle when Smith spoke again. "Sir, take my advice. Leave that place and find another room." Without turning back or replying to his words, I quickly left the shop. Chapter 6. The Ravine. Back at the house, I hastily ate a quick meal and stepped outside once again. I couldn't bear to stay indoors, despite the pouring rain and unfinished tasks. I decided to explore the surroundings of the house more thoroughly. A vague unease gnawed at me, refusing to let go. And there was another feeling, a sense of mystery, perhaps sinister and dark, but I was filled with a reckless determination to uncover it. The house was small, just 4 rooms and a living area. Built from massive stone blocks, it stood slightly apart from the other houses and seemed newer. I was curious to see what lay on the opposite side of the house, so I walked along a narrow path that ran alongside its facade. The path curved around the corner of the house, and I saw that it backed onto a dense thicket of wild heather. Approaching the shrubbery, I found myself on the edge of a ravine that dropped steeply downward. Through the greenery, I couldn't make out how deep the slopes went, so I decided to follow the ravine's edge, searching for any trail that might lead through the underbrush. It turned out the ravine was quite large. Water was already squelching in my boots, and my coat was soaked through, but I pressed on with the determination of a Spartan. Finally, my efforts were rewarded. Between the bushes, I saw a clearing and without hesitation moved toward it, a decision I immediately regretted. The soles of my boots slipped on the wet grass, and I fell backward, painfully hitting my back. Luckily, this wasn't the edge of the ravine, but just a ledge leading down to a small platform almost invisible from the outside. I got to my feet, brushed the clumps of dirt off my clothes, and looked around. The platform was about 10 yards across. Near the outer edge of the ravine, there were traces of ancient stone masonry, as if there had once been some structure or fence here. The opposite side of the platform dropped sharply downward, and the slope disappeared into the heather. Only here, standing on the very edge, was I able to see how deep the ravine truly was. About 10 yards below me, the wide crowns of beeches were visible, meaning the ravine was at least 30 yards deep. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, and I stepped back from the dangerous edge. Completely satisfied with my curiosity and shivering from the cold, I was ready to end this little adventure and head back to the house when I nearly stumbled again, tripping over some protrusion hidden in the thick grass. I crouched down and parted the grass with my hands. On the ground, I uncovered the outline of a stone monolith, circular in shape and covered with a layer of moss. Through the numerous cracks in its surface, grass had sprouted, which is why I hadn't noticed it earlier. The monolith was about 4 feet in diameter and was clearly man-made. Under the moss, some contours were faintly visible, so I began carefully clearing them with my hands. After 20 minutes of persistent work, which cost me scraped fingers and scratches, I cleared the stone surface and froze in amazement. The lines formed a drawing, albeit crude and primitive. Its time-worn outline still reminded me of a familiar beast. Just below the image, 6 letters were chiseled into the rough surface of the stone. I peered at their shapes and slowly made out the word they formed. U, K, U, B, U, N. I repeated it slowly, letter by letter. U, K, U, B, U, N. The unfamiliar word exuded something unpleasant, heavy, and ancient. My heart clenched with a sudden cold, as if some unseen icy hand had gripped it momentarily and then released it. I tried again to make out the image from different angles, but all my efforts to understand what was carved into the stone surface were in vain, and I left the task in disappointment. On my way back to the house, my enthusiasm for unraveling this old mystery had completely vanished. I walked in the rapidly approaching dusk, teeth chattering from the cold, cursing myself for my excessive curiosity. Everything that had happened already seemed like a wild fantasy of my overheated imagination, and I swore to myself that from this moment on, I would never think about this strange story again. Upon returning home, I lit the fireplace, changed into dry clothes, and returned to work, settling right by the roaring fire. For the first time in days, I worked easily and with great pleasure. Several hours flew by unnoticed, and as midnight approached, sleep began to overtake me. I yawned repeatedly, stretched with satisfaction, and leaving my papers in the hall, trudged to my room. My eyes were already closing, and as soon as my head touched the pillow, I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The awakening was quick and sudden. I was once again drenched in cold, clammy sweat, plunged into complete darkness, and overwhelmed by a wild fear that made my hair stand on end, and my skin crawl with tiny, itchy goosebumps. The rain had temporarily subsided, and there was complete silence, but I was absolutely certain that I hadn't woken from a nightmare or the stuffiness, but from some sound. Perhaps it was quiet, perhaps it was loud. It was gone now, but its vibration still echoed faintly in my mind. And the smell, that unpleasant, sharp smell, was back. It seemed to fill the entire room, but now it was stronger than before. My shoes and wet clothes were left by the fireplace, so they couldn't be the source. I got out of bed, walked across the room, and opened the door. Fresh air rushed to my face, making it easier to breathe. So the source of the smell was somewhere inside the room. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I cautiously stood in the middle of the room, sniffing the air. The smell seemed to be coming from all sides, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. After standing there for a few minutes, I began to feel cold. So I decided to leave the door slightly ajar and crawled back under the warm blanket. I was almost calm again and started thinking about sleep, attributing everything to my excessive nervousness and possibly distant echoes of thunder. And then, that sound returned. It was like the guttural growl of a very large animal. In it, I heard loneliness, longing, and some infernal impatience. The sound came from the direction of the window and, as it seemed to me, from the very depths of the ravine. I shivered under the blanket and tried to close my eyes again. All my fears resurfaced. The feeling that the house was perched on the very edge of the world, on the brink of a fragile cliff hanging over a bottomless, black and greedy abyss, didn't leave me for a single moment. I lay there, eyes wide open, flinching at every creak for what felt like a long time. The sounds didn't return. The rain began again, and I eventually drifted off into a heavy sleep to the sound of the storm. My awakening was dreadful. My head throbbed from the sleepless night. I realized I had slept far too long, and it was now almost noon. Unable to rise immediately, I tossed and turned restlessly for another half-hour, pondering the events of the night. At first, I firmly decided to go to the Brickmans and demand that they tell me everything that was going on. But after a few minutes of rational thought, I realized this wasn't a very good idea. What could I say to them? That young Brickman comes here from time to time. That's his right, and he warned me about it in advance. Besides, it doesn't cause me any discomfort. That the street is old and the houses are ruined, and that the place has a bad reputation? Well, that was more than half a century ago, and what, pray tell, do those events have to do with today? The nighttime sound from the depths of the ravine. That could be anything. The smell? Yes, the smell. But now, in the daylight, there's no trace of it in the room. It only appears at night, and even then, only briefly. I sighed heavily and massaged my temples. The room suited me perfectly in terms of price, and the entire house was at my complete disposal. It was unlikely I could find a better option right now. Besides, I had paid rent in advance until the end of the month. Brickman had insisted on this condition. I sighed again. I really didn't feel like getting up. And then I happily remembered my old acquaintance, Tom Dawson. When I was friends with him about 7 years ago, he worked as a junior clerk in one of the registration offices that kept records of all real estate transactions, including land deals. Only he could shed light on this strange story. Chapter 7. An Old Friend. I leaped out of bed with enthusiasm. It took me about 15 minutes to find the address of his office among my records. After a quick breakfast, I dressed warmly, grabbed an umbrella, and left the house. The walk through the cold rain on the muddy streets took me just over an hour. Exhausted by the weather and the biting wind, I finally arrived at the imposing front door of the law firm Richmond & Harris, which handled real estate transactions in West London. In the spacious lobby, a secretary at the desk politely inquired about the purpose of my visit. Learning that I was a friend of Mr. Dawson and wished to see him immediately, the secretary nodded and motioned to one of the junior clerks sitting nearby. "Jim will take you, sir. Mr. Dawson is on the second floor. Glad to assist you, sir." Accompanied by the young man, I ascended the massive oak staircase with its carved railings. Along the lengthy corridor were numerous doors. The clerk approached one of them, knocked, and upon hearing a response, cracked the door open and quickly spoke. Then he politely stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. In the small room, behind a desk draped with green baize, sat the same old Tom Dawson I had known many years ago. He hadn't changed a bit since then. His hair slicked back with pomade, a starched white collar, and now sporting a fashionably trimmed beard with a slight gain in weight. We warmly embraced, spending several minutes reminiscing about our years of friendship. After a brief pause, I explained to Tom that I wanted some information about a small property in the East End. He pondered my request for a moment. "I think I can help you, old friend," he said, giving me a light pat on the shoulder. "Not personally, of course. I have an acquaintance in your area. He also deals in real estate transactions." Tom walked over to the desk, took a blank sheet of paper, and quickly scribbled something on it with a bold hand. "Here, take this," he said, folding the paper and handing it to me. "His name is Billy Chubb. You'll find him at 12 Vixland Street, in the law office of Moritz & Son. Give him this letter, and he'll be sure to assist you." I thanked Tom and left his office. The journey to Vixland Street was quite far, and I decided not to waste any time. Chapter 8. Curious Real Estate. Mr. Chubb turned out to be a very pleasant young man of about 30. After reading Tom's letter, he politely inquired about my friend's well-being before asking the purpose of my visit. "Tom mentioned to me," I began somewhat hesitantly, "that you have access to registration records for real estate transactions in the East End, and that you might be able to help me." "Yes, that's correct. All transactions go through our law firm," Chubb said, narrowing his eyes slightly. "What specifically are you interested in? How can I assist you?" I paused for a moment, gathering my thoughts. "I'm interested in one of the streets in that area, Skinward Street. Specifically, house number 32 and a few houses nearby. They've been abandoned for many years, except for number 32. Chubb looked at me with interest, nodded slightly, and rubbed his clean-shaven chin. "I think I can dig up the history of the transactions for those houses or find out the names of their owners," Chubb said, rising from behind his desk. "However, it will take me some time. Tom wrote that this needs to be done urgently." He raised an eyebrow inquiringly. "Can you wait?" "Yes, of course." "Then," Chubb said, heading towards the door, "I'll need about half an hour, maybe a bit more." He cracked the door open and turned back to me. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be very kind of you. I've only had breakfast today." "I'll arrange for tea and some toast," Chubb said, as he left the room, closing the door behind him. Left alone, I distractedly surveyed the office. The high ceiling was adorned with ornate molding. The desk was solid beech, and heavy curtains hung over the windows. Clearly, Billy Chubb's law firm was thriving. I got up from the chair and nervously paced the room. The clock on the desk read 3:30. Outside, the rain continued to pour, its drops monotonously drumming on the metal cornice outside the window. A roll of thunder rumbled in the distance, slowly fading away. This whole story had rattled me. The feeling that something was about to happen hadn't left me for a single moment and was only growing sharper by the hour. I tried to calm myself, but it was utterly useless. The door quietly opened, and a young man entered, carrying a small silver tray with a steaming cup of fragrant tea and several appetizing slices of toast. He carefully placed the tray on the desk and silently left. I waited until the door closed behind him, then eagerly dug into the food. The toast was excellent. For a few moments, I even forgot about my problems and simply enjoyed the taste. Chubb entered the room unexpectedly and quickly. I was just finishing my tea and nearly spilled the cup on my frock coat. Paying no attention to this, he briskly approached the desk and sat down in his chair. "Imagine this," he began, spreading several sheets of paper covered in fine handwriting before him. "This is indeed an interesting case. It turned out to be devilishly difficult to find some of the documents, but we managed." I leaned forward eagerly, almost spilling the last of my tea on my trousers. "Let's start with the fact," Chubb continued, "that this place is very old. Some of the houses were built as early as the beginning of the 17th century. The owners of these houses, judging by the age listed in the registration or re-registration records, are long deceased, and their heirs have yet to make any claims to the inheritance. Yes, these houses are nearly in ruins and uninhabitable," I confirmed. "That's certainly odd. There have been a few inquiries from private individuals about the owners of this property, but we couldn't help them." He paused briefly before continuing. "As you probably know, the system for keeping registration records in England requires that all documents ever drawn up regarding any land parcel be stored in the Central Archive. So, a few years ago, we specifically dug through those documents in the archive, but found no mention of the previous owners purchasing new property anywhere," Chubb said, raising his eyebrows at me. "Which means they either started renting private housing or, more likely, left England permanently and tried to forget about this property." I drew in a sharp breath. The story was becoming increasingly mysterious and dark. "House number 32, Chubb continued, has been owned by the Brickman family since 1823. It was built by the great-grandfather of the current owner, Willie Brickman, along with his older brother Randy. Besides this house, the Brickman family owns house number 15 on Sachel Street. All transactions were legally documented and above board, if that's what you're interested in." Chubb fell silent and looked at me. He hesitated slightly but decided to continue. "There's something else about this place. In fact, there were 5 more houses there." He paused again. "And what became of them?" I asked anxiously. "They were also very old houses. According to the map, they were located roughly where house number 32 stands now. But there's no other house there besides the Brickmans. There's only a massive ravine," I interrupted Chubb impatiently. "Yes, you're absolutely right." He glanced at the papers before him. "Now there's a ravine there." I felt a chill run through me. "Are you saying there was no ravine before? And there were houses there?" I stammered in confusion. "Yes, that's correct," he nodded. "In 1815, it seems, Underground waters eroded the foundation of a massive section of earth, and it, along with the houses, sank deep into the ground, forming a large ravine. "And what about the people?" I blurted out. It happened at night, so the police could only begin rescue operations at dawn. Chubb paused, biting his lip. And as you might expect, no one survived. Stunned by his story, I sat motionless for a while, staring at a single spot. "Are you all right?" Chubb lightly touched my hand. "Yes, I'm fine." I looked at him. "It's just, all of this is so unexpected for me." I tried to force a smile, but I probably didn't do a very good job as Chubb gave me a strange look. Standing up, I thanked him for his help and headed for the door. I was almost out of the office when Chubb unexpectedly called out to me. "Forgive my curiosity, but why do you need this information?" "I'm living in that house," I replied shortly and stepped into the corridor, leaving Chubb deep in thought. Chapter 9. Evening. Night had fallen, but the streets were still lively and noisy, despite the downpour. The doorman closed the oak door behind me, and I found myself once again amidst the bustling chaos of the big city. Busy clerks were leaving their offices, hurrying home. Some hailed cabs with a wave or a whistle, but most, bundled up in their coats, walked briskly along the wet cobblestones, carefully stepping over murky streams of rainwater. This hustle and bustle distracted me somewhat from my grim thoughts. I pulled up the collar of my coat, trying to shield myself from the damp chill, opened my umbrella, and slowly trudged down Sachel Street toward home. I needed time to process Chubb's story and clear my mind. The rain poured down in torrents, and it seemed that if it kept up, all of London would soon be submerged, as streams of water rushed down its narrow streets, shrouded in darkness, and lit only by the occasional street lamp and the windows of shops. In truth, I mused, there was nothing particularly unusual about this story. Practically every corner of this gloomy city could tell a similar tale, full of mysteries and secrets from the perspective of the average person. But to me, all the so-called mysteries in these stories were merely the product of rumors and gossip passed down through generations of Londoners, who loved to tell these tales to their children, scaring them on long, dull evenings by the dim light of a candle. A cab rumbled past me, splashing my already soaked trousers with a fountain of dirty water. I wanted to shout in protest, but when I saw the poor driver hunched on the box under the cold rain, I thought better of it and walked on. Mysticism, spiritualism. I didn't believe in these fashionable phenomena. All my life experience and common sense told me that such things simply couldn't exist in our more than pragmatic world. And what could they possibly have to do with my story? Of course, I was deeply moved by Chubb's account of the old tragedy on that street, which had claimed the innocent lives of the residents of several houses. And the more I thought about that tragedy, the more vividly I imagined the events of that terrible night. The cold, the darkness, the screams, and the light of the windows slowly fading into the dark depths of the ravine as the earth continued to slide and slide. I involuntarily shuddered at this vision. It was so vivid that my whole body was covered in goosebumps. Suddenly, a bright flash of lightning momentarily illuminated the street I was walking down, and a peal of thunder roared deafeningly above the rooftops. I looked around absent-mindedly and realized that, lost in my troubled thoughts, I had already walked almost halfway home. The storm had truly unleashed its fury by evening. The wind had picked up, and its sudden and fierce gusts were relentlessly trying to wrest my umbrella from my hands. My coat was soaked through, and I could feel thin streams of icy water beginning to trickle down my back. It was getting cold, and I quickened my pace. I definitely shouldn't have delved into this old story. I already regretted succumbing to the sudden temptation to learn more than the circumstances required. The calm state of mind I had experienced in the first days of my move to this new apartment was now completely gone. All I felt now was a vague sense of unease and anxiety. It was around 8 in the evening when I finally reached the alley leading to my house. Thick, pitch-black darkness shrouded everything around, and only a faint, lonely lamp at the end of the alley barely lit the rickety porch and part of the cobblestones in front of the grim house. Cautiously stepping on the overgrown, slippery stones of the alley, I suddenly remembered how earlier today, absent-mindedly flipping through the calendar on Chubb's desk, I had noticed quite by chance how special this night would be. And indeed, the night was special. Usually, the pale light of the moon, though weak, would penetrate through small gaps between the low storm clouds. But not tonight. This night was the night of the new moon, the darkest night of the month when the moon completely disappears from the sky and reappears only after a few days. If anything could dampen my spirits even more at that moment, it was this seemingly insignificant fact that became the final straw. At that moment, the rain intensified, and heavy streams began to drum on my back. A blinding flash of lightning lit up everything around, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. I nearly sprinted toward the house, ignoring the huge puddles, and within seconds I had slammed the front door behind me with relief. To my considerable surprise, the living room was quite warm, and embers still glowed in the fireplace. Probably, I thought, one of the Brickmans had come by a few hours ago on some errand and decided to stoke the cooling house a bit. For me, this was very convenient. I quickly hung my soaked clothes in the hall and went to my room. Every muscle in my body ached from the long day's walk, and my head throbbed unbearably. So, as soon as I entered the room, I collapsed onto my bed and blissfully closed my tired eyes. And as I was already drifting into a deep sleep, through the thick, sluggish haze of drowsiness, I sensed that the room was filled with a heavy, oppressive smell. I barely managed to turn onto my side, but I had no strength left to get up or even open my eyes, and within moments, I plunged into a black, endless void. Chapter 10. Darkness. Beneath my awakening was sudden. I lay in complete darkness, my heart pounding like a hammer. A wild, primal fear gripped my entire body, from the top of my head to the tips of my fingers, as if I were a caveman confronting an unseen danger. The small room was filled with a thick, nauseating stench, which immediately caught in my throat and triggered waves of nausea. It felt as if the very air was saturated with the smell of decay and rot, as though I were entombed in a long-forgotten crypt deep underground. But there was something else, something that made the hair on my body stand on end, like a hunted animal sensing a predator. The floorboards in my bed were vibrating from powerful blows coming from below. I could hear sounds resembling the scratching of claws, tearing through wood, and the guttural growl of an unbelievably large creature, desperately trying to reach its prey, like a wolf that has scented its victim. I pressed myself into the bed, paralyzed by mortal terror. Another blow from a massive paw, then another. My breathing became a thin trickle. I was afraid to take a full breath, only drawing in small sips of air. Another strike made the writing desk tremble, sending the inkwell crashing to the floor. The creature froze for a moment, then resumed its frantic clawing at the room's floorboards with even more ferocity. I sat up abruptly in bed, pulling my knees to my chest, and with a trembling, cold hand, began frantically searching the desk for matches. Another dull thud, followed by the high-pitched screech of wood. I was shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I was on the verge of panic. Another blow. I was nearly thrown from the bed. Suddenly, a deafening clap of thunder sounded, and a bright flash of lightning illuminated the room, blinding me. But in that brief moment, I spotted the lamp and the matches on the desk. Darkness returned, along with the sound of wood creaking under claws, and that maddening growl. God. I clutched the lamp with my fingers so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and like a madman I began striking the thin match, desperate to light it. I succeeded, and within moments, the room was bathed in a dim yellow light. The blows from below ceased, but to my horror, in the silence that followed, I could hear the labored, raspy breathing of the beast lying in wait. The pale light from the lamp revealed the walls, the window streaked with murky rainwater, the closed door, and at that moment, a new wave of terror washed over me, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I had left the door open, and now it was tightly shut. Trying not to make a sound, I cautiously lowered my feet to the floor. My heart pounded wildly, and blood throbbed in my temples. But the moment my feet touched the icy floorboards, there was movement below. A massive body twisting and lunging toward me, and something heavy struck the floor directly beneath my feet. I gasped in surprise and quickly pulled my legs back. From beneath the floor, I heard the sound of dirt crumbling and a sharp, noisy exhalation, sending a thick cloud of dust through the gaps in the floorboards, carrying with it that nauseating stench of decay. My nerves couldn't take the strain any longer, and in a fit of wild panic, I leapt from the bed and dashed toward the door. At that moment, the floorboards beneath my feet vibrated violently under the weight of heavy blows. I heard the sound of crumbling earth and stones being hurled by monstrous paws. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it hard. The door flew open, and I barely managed to keep my balance, nearly tumbling into the center of the room. I rushed forward again and suddenly crashed into thick iron bars blocking my way. For several seconds I stared dumbfounded at the rusty bars, then grabbed them with one free hand and began shaking them furiously, trying to wrench the grate from its hinges. But it didn't budge. Worse still, a heavy steel lock hung on the brackets of the grate. And I screamed hoarsely, wildly, out of fear and despair. The floorboards beneath my feet vibrated with renewed force, and I was nearly thrown into the air by another blow. I screamed again. And suddenly, from the depths of the living room near the fireplace, a match was struck, and someone's hand lit a lamp. The light was very dim, and I could only make out the hand and part of the stranger's shoulder. But almost immediately I saw the face, and recognized it. At that moment, the sound of claws scraping against the wood echoed through the room. One of the floorboards snapped with a dry crack, and a thin crack ran along it. I took a gasping breath and stared in horror at the pale face of the man standing before me. His eyes were wide open, but there wasn't even a trace of humanity in them, only the mark of deep madness. It was John Brickman. The words that were ready to escape my lips froze, and a new wave of terrifying fear swept through my body. Submit. Brickman's voice trembled with excitement, rising to a shrill pitch. Submit, mortal. Ubun is coming. A powerful blow to the floor shook the walls, and then the boards groaned again. Brickman, you've gone mad, I shouted. Open the lock immediately. I began furiously shaking the grate again. A shadow flickered behind Brickman, and in the dim light of the lamp, I saw his father's face. The same mark of madness was upon it. Unnatural pallor, sagging, wrinkled skin, and wildly burning eyes of a lunatic. Mr. Brickman, thank God it's you. I pressed my face against the grate in weak hope, shuddering as I noticed the rusty brown stains on it. "Mr. Brickman, for the love of God, open the grate and tell me what's happening. I beg you." The old man didn't answer a word. He stretched out his hand, pointing a crooked, trembling finger behind me. "Ubun is coming. Submit." The old man's raspy, hollow voice echoed through the living room. "Kneel, mortal. Surrender your body, your blood, and your soul to him." Brickman's voice also turned into a shrill screech, causing him to cough hoarsely, clutching his thin chest with one hand. The blows to the floor grew more muted, and I realized that the boards would soon give way under the furious assault and split apart. At that moment, the Brickmans fell to their knees and pressed their foreheads to the floor. "Ubun, Ubun, Ubun." Their monotonous voices echoed eerily in a devilish rhythm with the blows to the floor and the creaking of the boards. I closed my eyes and lowered my head, still clutching the grate with one hand. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breathing was ragged and shallow. Only now did I fully realize that I had been trapped in a deadly snare, meant to be a sacrifice to some unknown creature now called Ubun. But no, I wasn't about to give up so easily. "Ubun, Ubun, Ubun." The panic subsided. I turned my back to the grate and looked at the center of the room. The floor shuddered under the blows, and the boards creaked in agony, ready to give way under the onslaught of the beast. Ubun. Lightning flashed again outside, and the rain pounded against the window with renewed intensity. Ubun. And at that moment, a deafening crack echoed through the room. The floor buckled, and several splintered boards jutted upwards, their jagged edges pointing toward the ceiling. The scuffling beneath the floor stopped, and silence fell. I could hear only the heavy breathing of the beast and the rain drumming against the window. The lamp trembled in my hand, casting flickering shadows across the room's walls. The creature lurked in the darkness, patiently watching me from the depths of the black chasm in the floor. I couldn't stop trembling, and it grew worse with each passing second. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't even move. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Trembling from head to toe, I slowly turned my head toward the door and recoiled in horror. The Brickmans were pressed against the grate, their faces frozen in an expression of fanatical ecstasy, eager for blood, with cruel, greedy smiles playing on their lips. Ubun loudly, wetly inhaled the air several times. Then I heard the sound of a large body shifting, and from the darkness of the chasm emerged a massive paw, covered in thick black fur, which slammed heavily onto the floor. Clods of fresh earth rained down on the boards with a thud. I nearly screamed in terror and clamped my free hand tightly over my mouth. It was a horrifying sight, especially because of its enormous size. The paw could easily grasp and crush a grown man's skull. Powerful claws gouged into the wood effortlessly, producing a dull scrape, as if the beast was trying to break free from its dark lair. The claws scratched against the boards, and in the next instant, the floor groaned from a powerful strike. Splinters and sharp fragments of wood flew in all directions. With a chilling growl, Ubun began widening the gap, slashing its paw forward with tremendous force, tearing through the wood. The floor trembled and buckled under the ferocious onslaught of the massive body, until finally it could bear no more and cracked in the center of the room. A second paw emerged from the breach. The claws dug into the wood as Ubun made a mighty pull upwards, struggling to heave itself out. Splintered boards flew toward the window and clattered to the floor. The writing desk toppled onto its side with a heavy thud and slowly slid along the tilted boards toward the chasm. Instinctively, I dashed to the bed, clutching its frame with a death grip, squeezing my eyes shut in terror. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. I could clearly hear the rain, the distant roll of thunder, and the heavy, guttural breathing. The room was now filled with a thick, nauseating stench. I opened my eyes and slowly turned my head toward the beast. And at that moment, everything went black. Not from fear, but from panic, an icy terror. The kind a mouse feels in the jaws of a bloodthirsty predator. In the center of the room, amidst the chaos of broken boards, loomed the head and part of the body of the repulsive creature. Two widely spaced, powerful paws held its massive frame aloft. It was covered in thick, filthy fur, and from its head emanated a sinister glow, reflecting off its enormous fangs, sharp and gleaming like knives. The gaping maw, large enough to swallow a man whole, was lined with rows of sharp teeth, ready to tear into its prey. Ubun's massive form shifted heavily, and I shuddered as I imagined the size of its body, hidden in the darkness. The enormous, sloping skull slowly turned in my direction and froze. The eyes... Only now did I see that the creature's eyes were bloodshot, and from its gaze emanated a ravenous, animalistic hunger. Ubun raised its snout and inhaled deeply through its broad nostrils several times. The boards groaned under its weight, and the floor tilted further toward the center of the room. I was standing only 8 feet away from the beast, my sweat-soaked back pressed firmly against the rough wall, my fingers still gripping the cold bed frame with a desperate, painful grip. Thud. I could hear my heart pounding. Thud. It felt like its beat echoed through the entire room. Thud. Ubun inhaled deeply once more and let out a low growl. Thud. I tried to calm my heart, but the blood pounded wildly in my temples. Thud. Suddenly, the beast pushed off the ground with its hind legs and lunged toward me. I screamed in terror, shielding myself with the fragile lamp. For an instant, the massive, fur-covered chest emerged from the gap in the floor, and the terrifying jaws snapped shut just a few feet from my side, and Ubun, with a thunderous crash, fell onto its side, thrashing violently, turning the remaining boards into splinters. At that moment, the floor beneath me gave way, and I lost my balance, falling through, hitting my back and shoulder hard first against the sharp edges of the boards, then against the hard ground. Miraculously, the lamp remained intact in my hand and didn't shatter upon impact. I lay on a steep slope, and below, I could see an enormous burrow dug into the earth. 2 incredibly thick, hideous hind legs dangled in the gap in the floor, frantically kicking at the air. Another crack echoed, and boards rained down from above as the left side of the room, along with the beast, collapsed with a crash and a cloud of dust almost to the wall. The enormous creature, clumsily twisting, began to slide deeper into the burrow, and clods of wet earth flew in all directions from its mighty paws. I rolled onto my side and quickly crawled to the right side of the room, painfully scraping my knees and elbows on the stones. There was just over 3 feet of space between the floor and the ground, and directly behind me was a brick wall that separated this room from the rest of the house. This was a trap, and there was no way out. Suddenly, the beast went quiet, and using its paws, flipped onto its belly. In the ensuing silence, I could only hear its heavy, powerful breathing and the pounding of my heart. The massive head began to sway side to side, sniffing the rancid, stale air, and within moments, it had zeroed in on my position. A fresh wave of terror chilled me to the bone, and trembling all over, I began slowly backing away toward the brick wall until I pressed against it. Hearing the sound of my movement, Ubun froze, tensed its body, and crouched low on its paws. Its snout locked onto my position, and a hoarse growl rumbled from its throat. I knew that in the next moment the creature would lunge at me and tear me to pieces. There was a crackling sound behind me and something crumbled. I quickly glanced over my shoulder. The dim, yellow light from the lamp revealed part of the dirty brick wall and a long crack running diagonally across it. I spun around on my back and frantically kicked at the old bricks with my bare feet. Ubun roared loudly and savagely. The bricks began to crumble one after another. I didn't notice the pain, even though I had already smashed my heels against their sharp edges, and each new kick left bloody streaks on the wall. And then Ubun leaped. I curled into a ball and squeezed my eyes shut. The crash of breaking boards and the sound of impact resounded again. The massive body got caught on the remnants of the floor, and the grotesque snout slammed into the ground right behind me. Ubun was stuck in the narrow space and frantically clawed at the earth, trying to squeeze through and reach me with its jaws. With all my strength, in complete desperation, I kicked at the wall. Once more. Again. And again. And it finally gave way. Oh God. I turned toward the beast and swung the lamp down hard onto its broad nostrils. The glass shattered and kerosene ignited on its wide snout. Ubun roared in pain and pulled back. I had only a moment, and then darkness would fall. I grabbed the crumbling bricks with both hands and yanked them free. A large section of the wall, weakened by water damage, couldn't hold and collapsed. Free. I quickly squeezed through the gap and turned to look at the beast. Ubun was still shaking its head, the last sparks of flames dying on its skin. It was a true spawn of hell. Suddenly, I heard excited voices and the sound of footsteps above. "He's down there beneath us!" John shrieked. "I'm telling you, he got out. I don't know how, but he got out." I froze and listened. This can't be. The old man's nervous, croaking voice echoed above me, accompanied by the shuffling of his feet. "Check it immediately." The faint light of a lamp filtered through the gaps between the floorboards, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Ubun growled hoarsely from the darkness of the breach, and the boards creaked once more. This shouldn't have happened. This shouldn't have happened. The old man's voice broke into a shriek. "Hurry!" There was the sound of a bolt being drawn, and a hatch in the floor not far from me swung open. Light flooded the basement, and I involuntarily squeezed my eyes shut. Ubun growled again, but this time much louder. And suddenly, it lunged at me with renewed force. In a matter of seconds, the remaining floorboards splintered under the pressure of its back, and a clawed paw appeared in the breach, effortlessly smashing through the intact brickwork. I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze away from the enraged beast. Ubun shoved its snarling snout under a thick beam, and unable to move further, began furiously digging at the ground with its claws. This was beyond my endurance. I dashed toward the open hatch and grabbed its edges with my hands. "There he is!" John shouted, and I saw the glint of a blade. Only my incredible luck saved me from instant death. The wide axe blade slammed into the wood just inches from my head. The axe swung again. I recoiled. The blade whistled past my nose. The axe arced upward, and John, losing his balance, tumbled through the hatch right at my feet. He tried to get up, but did so too quickly, banging his head on the boards and collapsing back to the ground. This was my chance for survival. I quickly dropped to my back, tucked my legs in, and kicked them out with all my strength, straight into John's side. He grunted, flying a few feet away, then fell heavily onto his back and tried to get up again. But this time, he couldn't. He was now directly in front of Ubun's snout. A heavy paw struck his chest, cracking his ribs, and the claws dug into his side with a deadly grip. A wild scream filled with terror and pain echoed through the basement. With terrifying speed, Ubun opened its maw and clamped down on the man's head, snapping his neck. The scream was abruptly cut off, and I watched in horror as the beast began to drag the limp, lifeless body beneath itself, slowly retreating into the darkness. I vomited onto the dirt floor, my vision swimming with bright spots. I crawled toward the hatch, quickly pulling myself up into the room, and without seeing anything around me, I fled the cursed house in a state of utter madness. Chapter 11. The Idol from the Dark. I struggled to open my eyes, only to shut them again immediately as a sharp pain, like a red-hot needle, pierced my brain. I groaned and tried to roll onto my side. The pain returned, this time shooting through my entire body. It felt as though there wasn't a single spot on me that wasn't aching, but the most intense pain was in my feet and heels. I froze and listened. Somewhere nearby, rain was drumming against a window, and judging by the sound, I was in a large room or spacious chamber. Once more, despite the pain, I tried to open my eyes. After several attempts, I managed to do so and finally took in my surroundings. A large room with a high white ceiling, gray walls. Opposite the bed where I lay was the door to the room. It was slightly ajar, and muffled voices could be heard outside. I glanced to the left, where the sound of the rain was coming from. There was a large window through which I could see the blurred outlines of some gray, drab buildings. Gathering my strength, I tried to prop myself up on my elbows, but a new wave of sharp pain forced me to collapse back onto the bed with a groan. At that moment, the door opened, and a young, pleasant-looking woman in a nurse's uniform peeked into the room. She glanced at me quickly, let out a soft gasp, and immediately disappeared into the adjoining room. "Mr. Dawson, Mr. Dawson," I heard her excited whisper. "Come quickly, Mr. Dawson. He's awake." There was an exclamation of joy, the creak of a sofa, and quick footsteps across the room. The door swung open, and old Tom burst into the room. I must admit, I had never been so glad to see him as I was at that moment. Tom's face beamed with genuine happiness as he rushed to my bedside and warmly grasped my hand. I winced in pain, and he reluctantly loosened his grip. "Finally, my friend. You have no idea how worried we've been about you." He continued to shake my hand. "Where am I? Where are the Brickmans?" I rasped, forcing the words out despite the excruciating pain in my chest. "For God's sake, where is that monster?" "Calm down, my friend. It's all over, and you're perfectly safe now." Tom finally released my hand and settled into the chair next to my bed. "We're at St. Mary's Hospital. You've been unconscious for the past 2 days." A chill ran through me. 2 days? I croaked. "Yes, that's right. 2 long, damned days." He slapped his leg with a grin. "We were afraid you wouldn't make it. But Dr. Evans assured us that your terrible condition was merely the result of severe shock. And within a few days, you'd be on the mend." He smiled again. "And that's exactly what happened. Don't keep me in suspense. Tell me everything." Despite my weakness, I couldn't bear his chatter any longer, or remain in the dark about the events of the past few days. "Well," Tom hesitated slightly, "I can't take all the credit away from our mutual friend Chubb and Inspector Stanley." He grinned slyly. "But for the sake of charity, very well. By the way, I've already sent for Chubb and Stanley, and by my calculations they should be here any minute. Come on. I would have kicked Dawson if not for my weakness. How did I end up here?" You burst into Smith the grocer's shop in the middle of the night and scared his entire pious family half to death. Dirty, soaked in torn clothes, and barefoot with your feet torn to shreds. I don't remember that. And it's no wonder. You were trembling all over. At first, Smith thought it was just from the cold. But when he saw your wild eyes, he realized you were shaking with pure terror. He recognized you immediately and called the police. And what happened next? The constable on duty turned out to be a particularly sharp fellow. He quickly realized this was no ordinary case and immediately reported the incident to his superiors. Tom paused and ran his hand through his hair. Then Smith remembered the address where you were renting a room, and when Inspector Stanley arrived, a police squad was sent there right away. You also mentioned Billy Chubb. Is he all right? I asked anxiously. Chubb. Tom smiled. After your evening visit, Bill couldn't get that strange story out of his head, and just in case, he contacted his old friend, Chief Inspector William Stanley of Scotland Yard, and asked him to visit the Brickman house the next day to check if everything was in order and if there was any cause for concern. Tom chuckled and shrugged. But events unfolded too quickly, and the inspector didn't. Dawson didn't finish his sentence, as two men entered the room at that moment. One of them was Chubb, and the other, a tall, lean man, was, as I immediately guessed, the inspector himself. Speaking of which, here they are. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Tom rose from his chair and, stepping forward to meet the men, shook their hands firmly. I've already told our hero a bit, Tom smiled broadly, but I've left the main events for you gentlemen to share. Chubb approached my bed and cautiously shook my hand. Sir, I'm sincerely glad to see you in good health. In my opinion, very few could have survived such ordeals and remained sane. He turned slightly toward the inspector. Allow me to introduce Chief Inspector William Stanley of Scotland Yard, my close friend. The inspector nodded politely and took a step forward. You're incredibly fortunate, sir, Stanley said in a low, commanding voice of a man accustomed to giving orders. I would even call it a miracle. As we've determined, you're the only person to have left that cursed house alive in the past 50 years. I stared at the inspector in utter astonishment. Yes, it's absolutely true, Stanley continued calmly, nodding. But it seems Mr. Dawson hasn't had a chance to tell you yet? He looked at me questioningly. When you entered the room, sir, Meister Dawson had just mentioned that a police squad was sent to the Brickman house under your command. I told you, Stanley, Tom said excitedly, that I left the most interesting parts for you. You're very kind, Mr. Dawson, Stanley replied without a trace of a smile, though I noticed a brief glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Everyone settled into the chairs kindly brought in by the attendant. Stanley crossed one leg over the other and, in this relaxed position, continued his story. As soon as I was informed of the unusual incident on Skinward Street, I remembered Billy's request and asked the duty sergeant to confirm the description of the man involved with the constable. Everything matched your description, sir. I immediately sent for Mr. Chubb and rushed to the scene. Stanley cleared his throat several times. I won't describe the terrible condition we found you in. So I ordered you to be taken to St. Mary's Hospital right away, accompanied by Billy and one of the constables. A few minutes later, an armed police squad arrived, and we headed to house number 32. I'll be honest with you, sir. I can't recall a crazier night in my entire career. And as you might imagine, I've seen a lot in my time with the police. When we approached the house in the pouring rain, we saw the door wide open. Inside, the house was completely dark. I left 5 men outside and went inside with 2 constables. What we saw in the light of our lanterns still sends shivers down my spine, sir. Old Brickman was crouched in the far corner of the living room, in the shadow of the fireplace, sobbing uncontrollably, his head and face buried in his hands. He didn't even acknowledge us when we entered. Nearby, the hatch to the basement was wide open, with a massive axe lying next to it. A trail of bloody footprints led from the hatch to the front door. But the most horrifying sight was yet to come. On one of the doors, a grate had been installed, and behind it was a nightmare that could only be conjured in a horrific dream, or the mind of a madman. Almost nothing was left of the room's floor, and in the center gaped a huge, monstrous hole, with thick streaks of blood visible around the edges. Stanley fell silent and gave us a heavy look. In the ensuing silence, only the sound of rain against the window could be heard. "And Ubun?" I couldn't hold back. "Did you see Ubun?" The inspector hesitated before answering. It was extremely risky to approach that hole at night in such poor light, so I decided to postpone the examination until morning and ordered the house to be cordoned off. We managed to bring Eliza Brickman to her senses only by morning, and that was thanks to Dr. Evans. The old man was completely devastated by the loss of his son, but he was still able to shed some light on this dreadful story. I listened to the inspector, holding my breath. He cleared his throat again. "They call this creature Ubun," he finally said slowly. "Your savior, Mr. Smith, told us that the entire area around the ravine is dotted with ancient totems bearing this word and a symbol depicting a monster resembling a wolf," I whispered in shock. Only now did it dawn on me what that symbol I had seen on the edge of the ravine on the surface of the ancient monolith resembled. "Exactly," Stanley continued impassively. "As you correctly noted, it was indeed the image of a monster or creature very similar to a wolf. Of course, if you disregard its size." He smiled grimly and then looked at Chubb. "I see my friend Billy is eager to share what he's uncovered about this complex case." Indeed, as I had noticed, Chubb had been fidgeting impatiently in his chair for several minutes, rubbing his hands excitedly. "Thank you, my dear friend." Chubb finally leaned back in his chair with relief. Without false modesty, I must admit that I had to sift through a mountain of documents to get to the truth. "I can vouch for that," Tom chimed in with a smile. "He practically lived in his beloved archives day and night. But forgive me for interrupting you. Please continue." "Some records claim that the cult of Ubun dates back to ancient times. Several legends mention that in these parts and around Plymouth, blood sacrifices were made to an unknown and terrible creature that dwelled in caves and tunnels deep underground. Over time, this cult was forgotten, but only until 1643, when a certain community settled here in East London. As soon as I was informed of the unusual incident on Skinward Street, I remembered Billy's request and asked the duty sergeant to confirm the description of the man involved with the constable. "Everything matched your description, sir." I immediately sent for Mr. Chubb and rushed to the scene. Stanley cleared his throat several times. "I won't describe the terrible condition we found you in, so I ordered you to be taken to St. Mary's Hospital right away, accompanied by Billy and one of the constables. A few minutes later, an armed police squad arrived, and we headed to house number 32. I'll be honest with you, sir. I can't recall a crazier night in my entire career. And as you might imagine, I've seen a lot in my time with the police. When we approached the house in the pouring rain, we saw the door wide open. Inside, the house was completely dark. I left 5 men outside and went inside with 2 constables. What we saw in the light of our lanterns still sends shivers down my spine, sir. Old Brickman was crouched in the far corner of the living room, in the shadow of the fireplace. sobbing uncontrollably, his head and face buried in his hands. He didn't even acknowledge us when we entered. Nearby, the hatch to the basement was wide open, with a massive axe lying next to it. A trail of bloody footprints led from the hatch to the front door. But the most horrifying sight was yet to come. On one of the doors, a grate had been installed, and behind it was a nightmare that could only be conjured in a horrific dream, or the mind of a madman. Almost nothing was left of the room's floor, and in the center gaped a huge, monstrous hole, with thick streaks of blood visible around the edges. Stanley fell silent and gave us a heavy look. In the ensuing silence, only the sound of rain against the window could be heard. "And Ubun?" I couldn't hold back. "Did you see Ubun?" The inspector hesitated before answering. It was extremely risky to approach that hole at night in such poor light, so I decided to postpone the examination until morning and ordered the house to be cordoned off. We managed to bring Eliza Brickman to her senses only by morning, and that was thanks to Dr. Evans. The old man was completely devastated by the loss of his son, but he was still able to shed some light on this dreadful story. I listened to the inspector, holding my breath. He cleared his throat again. "They call this creature Ubun," he finally said slowly. "Your savior, Mr. Smith, told us that the entire area around the ravine is dotted with ancient totems bearing this word and a symbol depicting a monster resembling a wolf," I whispered in shock. Only now did it dawn on me what that symbol I had seen on the edge of the ravine on the surface of the ancient monolith resembled. "Exactly," Stanley continued impassively. "As you correctly noted, it was indeed the image of a monster or creature very similar to a wolf. Of course, if you disregard its size." He smiled grimly and then looked at Chubb. "I see my friend Billy is eager to share what he's uncovered about this complex case." Indeed, as I had noticed, Chubb had been fidgeting impatiently in his chair for several minutes, rubbing his hands excitedly. "Thank you, my dear friend." Chubb finally leaned back in his chair with relief. "Without false modesty, I must admit that I had to sift through a mountain of documents to get to the truth." "I can vouch for that," Tom chimed in with a smile. He practically lived in his beloved archives day and night. But forgive me for interrupting you. Please continue. "Some records claim that the cult of Ubun dates back to ancient times. Several legends mention that in these parts and around Plymouth, blood sacrifices were made to an unknown and terrible creature that dwelled in caves and tunnels deep underground. Over time, this cult was forgotten, but only until 1643, when a certain community settled here in East London." I stared at Chubb in amazement, seemingly holding my breath. "Around 15 families," he continued, "including our dear Brickmans, purchased a plot of beach-covered wasteland near Skinward Street and built their homes on it. We can only speculate about their reasons for moving to London, but in the registration documents, I found a note that they had come from Cornwall, and Plymouth, as you know, is not far from its borders." "So, are you saying," I interrupted him, "that they knew about the existence of the creature?" "That's unlikely." Chubb shook his head doubtfully. "But I'm certain they knew the legend and knew that signs related to the ancient cult still remained in these parts." "Wait a minute." I was genuinely surprised. "But then, how do you explain that house? How do you, finally, explain that terrifying room? Chance..." "What?" I didn't understand. "A tragic and accidental chain of events," Chubb explained, furrowing his brow. "You probably remember your recent visit to my office." "Yes, of course." I still didn't see where he was heading. "You told me about the property and... Oh my God, don't tell me. It was as if lightning had struck me. The ravine. Yes. Chubb sighed. There's your answer. It happened in 1815. Police reports indicated that on the night of March 14th, 5 houses collapsed into the ground, along with all their inhabitants, and despite rescue efforts, they couldn't be reached. For a few seconds, there was silence, with only the sound of rain outside the window. And 6 years later, Chubb finally broke the silence. In September 1821, the locals were shocked by another tragedy. According to eyewitnesses, in the middle of the night there was a terrible noise and screams from the community, but after a couple of minutes, everything went silent. When the police arrived, they found that one of the houses, located right next to the ravine, had been partially destroyed, with a massive hole in its wall. Under the rubble of bricks and beams, the bodies of a woman and her 5-year-old son were found. The head of the family was never found. Chills ran down my spine as I recalled the grim house I had stood before just days earlier. The case was soon closed. Police preferred to attribute the tragedy to rotten timbers, and the community members themselves didn't push for further investigation. Yes, that was a fatal mistake. Stanley shook his head. Had the police been more vigilant, how many lives could have been saved? The next tragedy, Chubb continued, occurred a year later. It happened again in September, during heavy rains. As before, there were screams and loud noises from the community, and when the police arrived, they found a terrible breach in the wall of a house. None of the owners seemed to be seriously injured, but the inspector was suspicious of the thick bloodstains on the floor and the wild fear gripping the entire family. The inspector decided to postpone questioning until morning, but the next day, it was discovered that the family had unexpectedly left London and vanished without a trace. And within a week, the police found that all the other houses were empty, with no one left to question. Still, I broke the silence that followed Chubb's words. For God's sake, explain to me how that monstrous house came to be. That story, Inspector Stanley spoke up, was told to us by Eliza Brickman himself. He cleared his throat and continued. You see, his father Willie had an older brother named Randy. From childhood, they had heard legends about a monster that lived underground and emerged once a year on the darkest, moonless, and rainiest nights. After the second tragedy, the brothers deduced that the creature came from the ravine and set out to find it. Within a few days, they discovered a deep burrow at the very edge of the ravine. And a year later, a house was built on that spot, constructed around a single room meant for sacrifices. My God, I couldn't help but exclaim. That's madness. Yes, you're absolutely right. Stanley looked me in the eye intently. The Brickman family, on the male side, suffered from mental illness. But things got much worse after the brothers first encountered the creature. I can't imagine how they planned to control its rage. But as a result of that encounter, Randy died, and Willie lost his mind completely. It was from his father's incoherent ramblings that Eliza learned of the existence of the dreadful room, and soon after, a mad plan began to form in his mind, a plan that later included his son John. And why did Ubun emerge from the depths only once a year? I asked again, astonished by the inspector's tale. In that regard, my friend, we can only speculate, Tom answered for the inspector, rising from his chair and walking over to the window. We don't know what this creature is, but it has lived in dark, damp depths for as long as anyone can remember, and perhaps any light causes it unbearable pain, so it only comes to the surface during the rainiest and darkest time of the year. He fell silent, watching the rain run down the murky glass. I see you have another question on your mind. Stanley suddenly spoke again, winking at me slyly. Yes, you're right, Inspector. I'm eager to know what happened to Ubun. Did you find it? Unfortunately, I must disappoint you. Stanley's face grew serious once more. My men searched the bottom of the ravine and found a cave leading deep down, but we didn't dare to descend into it. On the police chief's orders, the entrance to the cave was blown up, and in a few months, the ravine will be flooded. The inspector paused briefly and added, I pray to God that London will never hear of this creature again. At that moment, the door opened and Dr. Evans appeared in the doorway. His face bore a concerned expression. Gentlemen, he said in a stern voice, I must ask you to leave my patient alone. He's still weak, and I'm absolutely certain that none of you would want him to lose consciousness again for a long time. Yes, doctor, don't worry. We're leaving. Tom approached me and gently shook my hand. I'll visit you in a few days, my friend. I'm sure you'll be up and about quickly under the care of our esteemed doctor. All right, gentlemen. Dr. Evans spread his arms wide, ushering the smiling men toward the door. I called out to Stanley just as he was about to leave. Inspector, what will happen to old Brickman? He turned and pondered for a moment. His fate will be decided by the courts, but I'm absolutely certain that whatever punishment they impose on him, it won't be worse than the one he's already received by losing his only son. The door closed, and the room fell silent. I lay there for a long time with my eyes open, staring at the white ceiling, horrified at the thought that somewhere beneath London, in the dark and silent depths, lurked a vicious and bloodthirsty creature called Ubun.